So as you have figured out now, what are we trying to do with iShare? We are trying to understand the diversity of models of the sharing economy here in Germany, go in depth and understand these models, but also similarities across models that are not so kind of obvious. And finally, also try to understand what can we take from that for impact of the sharing economy, but also scaling of different models. We do that now in Germany. And we are very grateful for the support we got. But we also have, in mind that Germany is not an orbit, but it's part of a larger global world. And so we will use this last part to also already start a little bit to think about how do realities here in Germany fit with other parts of the world? How are some of the models that we have here, very successful models that are actually very kind of coming to fruition here in Germany, how would they relate to the larger picture of the sharing economy? So I would love to kind of invite our panelists here to the podium. You will see again Peter van der Glind. We will have Benedikt Franke from the CEO, co-founder of Helpling with us. And we have Helen Goulden, last but not least, from Nesta. And Helen will kick us off. And in a second, she will take over from me. And Helen is the executive director of the innovation lab of Nesta. Some of you know Nesta. Nesta is this amazing organization that if you introduce Nesta 1 year, the next year they have moved on and they reinvent themselves. But they keep kind of being a not-for-profit trust, very much kind of centered on innovation, knowledge creation. And I think Helen's own biography speaks for that. She has before joining Nesta in 2009, I think she was in the private sector, but she has consulted a lot with the Cabinet's office. She has worked with cities, and she was one of the first ones to actually also, within Nesta, but in general, kind of to do a little bit of a deeper digging into the sharing economy, also again with Rachel Botsman, and also Nesta and Rachel together with Peter, they are really kind of behind this idea of let's create also dissemination platform for research. We are very honored to have you here. I will try to put up your presentation.
Well, I don't need to tell you what Nesta has done now because you've just done a fantastic job of selling it, but maybe while this is coming up, the formal kind of definition of Nesta is that we are an innovation foundation, and we exist to support innovation for public good. And we do that through financing innovation and supporting, thank you. We do it through research, we do it through trying to develop skills and capabilities for innovation with the people that we work with. And probably the cheapest thing that we do is probably the most impactful, actually, which is try to bring people together from different sectors and different disciplines to have new kinds of conversations in the hope that new kinds of collaborations and new ideas will emerge. So that's that. Johanna asked me to come and talk to you about the sharing economy, and I sort of selected this as a title, which is The Many Roads Ahead. And many roads because the sharing economy is actually many things. And there's so many assumptions that are being made about the sharing economy, and depending on which bit of it you grab, if you like, you perceive it differently. There is a very good chance that we will end up on very different tracks depending on which perhaps dominant models play out more fulsomely, or as I might predict, we'll enter into a period of much greater complexity, and the idea of the term the sharing economy will probably not be around, I wouldn't have thought, for more than a couple of years, maybe that. So not only does the sharing economy encompass so much, it also has many names and definitions. This is what I mean when I'm talking about the sharing economy, which is emerging infrastructures. I will kind of assume that the majority of them are digital, that enable the coordination of knowledge, resources, money and labour, and of course using technology that allows you to do that at scale. So I want to show you this, which is a piece of research that was undertaken by PwC. It was published early 2014, I think. And it had made a very bold claim, which was that by 2025, the sharing economy would be worth $335 billion. And that grabbed some headlines. And a lot of people went, oh, that sounds interesting. Of course, there was I guess what I'm showing you this for is because it sort of tells you what's wrong with the state of research in the sharing economy. We want some headline-grabbing numbers. We make some really strong assumptions that the dominant players and models and verticals that it's operating in today will be the dominant models, platforms, and verticals of the future. And it flattens this down to an economic case, when, of course, I think some of us will know on this platform that the environmental and social gains from the sharing economy could potentially be far greater than the economic. This is one of the sort of graphs from our research, which was again conducted sort of late 2013. And we were trying to look at participation, so how many people were engaged in online activities that you could call collaborative or sharing. And we found that 25% of people had used the internet to engage in collaborative activities. We thought that's really high. That's very high. When you start breaking that down, you realize that it's because we're defining this in such a broad way. If you look at the number of people in 2013 in the UK that had used a short-term accommodation platform, for example, that number drops to about 1%. Skill sharing, it kind of hovers around 4 or 5%. But we're still looking at what we would call, I guess, early adopter phase, despite the acceleration of conversations. I hesitate to say this, but there are some things that we know, I think. So we know that these are disruptive business models that challenge, that offer different ways to meet our needs. I think we know that. I think we also know that it challenges existing regulation, licensing, it shifts consumer patterns and behaviours, and it challenges incumbent businesses and industries. I think we can safely say that it's safer than we would have predicted. So if you had told me a decade ago that I'd go and meet a stranger online and then pay him some money and then go to his house and then go up his stairs and sleep in his spare room, I would have told you that I wouldn't do that. But I do that quite a lot now, along with millions and millions of other people. So I'm not saying it's completely safe, but I think our perceptions of risk in the sharing economy are not always borne out. We know that it makes much more efficient use of resources. That's sort of what it's about when it comes to sharing resources. But it also, I think, we can kind of know that it tends to widen the pool of provision. We're bringing more people, more inventory, more resources and skills into the economy, into our communities when we think about the sharing economy. And it tends to be more affordable. But I would put a little caveat and say that while it tends to be more affordable, it's cheaper for me to use Uber than it is to use a black cab, for example, that affordability might come at a price. And it's inherently more personalised and social. It's more flexible and it's on demand. It feels different to how you might engage with a bank or a hotel or whatever. So this is why I get excited about the sharing economy. Because since the Industrial Revolution, really, commercial investment, industries, manufacturers, they've been concerned with this, within efficiencies in production. And, you know, I don't know what the amount of investment is, but I suspect it's great, continually and relentlessly trying to drive down the cost of production at the same time as maximizing output, usually at some degree of cost, either environmental or whatever. Now we see an economy that actually looks like it's looking at efficiencies in consumption. That's turning the whole thing on its head. Now, if we're in an environment, in a world where we have a growing population that needs to meet its needs, we have degradation of natural resources, we have all of the challenges that result from a changing climate, we have some dwindling natural resources, we haven't yet exploited new technologies and new materials that might compensate for that. But this, to me, is a good thing. And it comes with a whole load of challenges, and it's fairly profound, actually, when you start unpacking it, of course. So, what are the roads ahead? Well, I want to give you some very sort of broad pictures about what I think the roads ahead are. But I want to do that by telling you or talking through some of the assumptions that we make. And by exploring the assumptions that we make about the sharing economy, we begin to unpack the various forks in the road. Where could this end up? Where do we really need to pay attention? What research needs to be done? What do policymakers need to be thinking about? The first is, I sort of challenge the assumption that this is for everybody. So, you have a situation where, yes, if you've got a mobile phone or a laptop and you've got some connectivity and you've got some degree of digital literacy and agency, then yes, this is for you. In theory, it's for you. But actually, in reality, that's not the case at all. If you look at our results of our participation, it showed that it's young, affluent, urban people. And usage declines quite rapidly if you go into older, poorer, sort of lower socio-demographic groupings. Now, that means that the people who could most benefit from making and saving money in the sharing economy are, at the moment at least, the least likely to be engaging in it. There's some really promising data out there about, in various different pockets, about why this is actually, there's actually some good things to come from this. If I want to go and get money from a venture capital for my startup, and I go to a traditional VC, I'm 4% likely as a woman to be successful. If I go to a crowdfunding platform, I'm 47% likely to be successful. So there are interesting ways in which you might think, and there's probably much more research needed, about kind of gender balancing within the sharing economy. But if I'm a black male wanting to rent out my property on a short-term accommodation rental, I'm less likely to earn money than if I'm a woman, particularly a white middle-class woman. So that is an unhappy fact, born of some research, but again, I want more to be done. But it speaks to a broader challenge, which is that old prejudices could play out in new ways in a peer-to-peer economy. So if I am gay and I go to a hotel with my partner and the hotel says, you can't come in here because you're gay, there's some recourse, there's regulation, there's good regulation, and there's laws about it. In an online peer-to-peer marketplace, it's a little bit more murky, actually. Where is your recourse? How could you tell if someone consciously or unconsciously made a decision about whether to engage with you or not? It's very murky territory. And if you add into that the idea that algorithms and positive feedback loops will continually feed you more of what you want, more of what you take, you can become in a situation where you're crowding out diversity. You're only associating with people who look and sound like you. It won't be the truth for everyone, but I think, again, it's worthy of exploration. Is the sharing economy about sharing? I'm sure this has been touched on a million times already. So yes, it is. There are fantastic grassroots organisations out there, some fantastic local startups and enterprises doing some amazing stuff, but the majority of platforms that have punctured through into the public consciousness, those that are most successful in terms of users globally, are highly monetised, they're commercial, and our data shows that the reason people engage with these platforms is to make money. That won't be the only reason, but it's certainly the primary reason in the UK. That leads us to a story that you see in the press a little bit, which is about, okay, so if we're making money, this is a new wave of micro-entrepreneurs. So one day I can rent out my apartment, one day I can mow someone's lawn, one day I can do this. It's like it's drifted into a narrative of empowerment, that this is a good thing that you can do this. And for certain people, it will be. Certainly freelancers, people who are used to kind of doing perhaps more higher value freelance jobs from organisation to organisation, work very well. But if you're at the lower end of the labour market, we know that there are some tricky challenges that haven't been fully resolved. Now, I'm a fan of the sharing economy, but I still worry about predictability of income, employment rights and status, and how workers can generally be empowered, and at what point that empowerment shifts into something a little bit more negative. Another assumption that I would just like to explore a little bit is the idea that this is peer-to-peer. So yes, it is often, but of course you will know that there are many business-to-consumer models out there as well. I fundamentally believe that is a brilliant thing, because the more manufacturers, industries, retailers are shifting their mindset to be thinking about not selling products but becoming service providers of products, the more you're going to have an economic business case for driving sustainable product development and more efficient use of resources. So that's a good thing. A lot of the peer-to-peer platforms over time are maturing, and they're evolving into a much more mixed service of provision. They're doing that either strategically or it's happening organically. So at a strategic end of the spectrum, you have Just Park. Just Park used to be a peer-to-peer marketplace where I have a car I need to park, you have a driveway, I'm just going to stay in your driveway. That's good. Now it's evolved, and now it doesn't matter whether it's Johanna's driveway or it's a national car park or a commercial car park. Just Park will tell me the nearest and the best car park to go to. That's a kind of mixed peer-to-peer B2C model. On the other hand as well, when it's happening organically, you see things like Airbnb. I think we're probably aware of the New York statistic that 47% of the rooms on Airbnb, this is data from last year, are owned by 6% of the hosts. So that's not you and me sharing something, that's me sharing something with all of you, which is slightly different, I think. Now, I don't make any judgment about whether this is right or wrong, actually. But what I do think it needs a question is it implicit in the sharing economy that we build social value, social cohesion by default? Because that's a kind of narrative that's out there. I don't necessarily think that's the case always. Another assumption, that this is about consumers and it's about beds and cars. We all know there's a range of platforms out there that do absolutely 101 different things apart from that. But I think there's been a general kind of lack of imagination, really, and certainly a lack of innovation in how you think about taking the principles of the sharing economy and applying them to much more public policy, social, civic, general challenges. So think about what is inherent within the sharing economy and how it could be used to create public sector efficiencies. So this is a platform called Kahilo. It's US-based, and it's essentially a marketplace for mapping the supply and demand of medical equipment within a local healthcare system, resulting in more efficiency, more availability of some of the products in it. You could think about that model in 100 different ways within the public sector, but we're still not quite there. Equally, you could think about it as innovating new forms of public service provision. The example here is shared lives. So if you have a vulnerable young adult in institutional care, that will cost the state a good deal of money, and the outcomes for those young people aren't always that positive. State care is good, but it's not quite what people need. Shared lives matches people who are in care homes and placing them in houses. That's long-term, sustained social sharing. It's 30,000 euros per person per year to house people in a family, and lo and behold, of course, you get much better outcomes in terms of well-being, health, engagement with communities. There's a whole raft of things that we could really, if we thought imaginatively about in terms of public sector, we could really do something. Again, we mustn't dismiss the idea of actually this being about new sources of knowledge. So sticking with the health theme, you have patients like me, bringing together sharing of resources and information of clinicians, researchers, people with long-term health conditions and illnesses and their families, and bringing them together to create new insights and create new peer support networks. And what's happening in all of those things is really that we're at the tip. We're doing it a little bit. You can sort of see it emerging, that there is a new form of alternative infrastructure being built, and it's happening in a number of different ways. So you can go to peer-to-peer finance platforms or crowdfunding to access finance instead of going to a bank. That's a new kind of infrastructure. We can, in a mass sort of observation and participation way, share very small bits of data with each other to reveal new knowledge and new sources of knowledge. We can think about how this is an infrastructure for mobilizing people and action. So this is an example here of a marketplace, very much like TaskRabbit. It's in the UK, except it's for cancer patients. So if my lawn needs mowed, or I need some milk, or I need something in my community, I can post it on the marketplace and someone will help me. Now these are kind of interesting. I think these platforms do tend to think about how they build social provision and public care. These two together are incredibly interesting. So we're seeing more and more examples of how collective intelligence as a way of mobilizing people in times of disaster, turbulence, civil unrest of all kinds. This is tremendously important infrastructure, really, in many parts of the world, not least Europe. And of course, we're thinking about, if you're thinking about exchanging in different ways, you're thinking about valuing things in different ways, you start thinking about new currencies. Now, you will have heard of Bitcoin, but Echo is a time credit and businesses are using it to exchange with each other in return for assets, skills, resources as a way of building local economic growth and addressing sometimes cash flow problems. The last two. So let's challenge the assumption that it's global. I suspect everyone on this platform knows it's not global. It's actually much more complicated for that. But a very strong story makes its way through into the press. We assume that the sharing economy, if you ask somebody on the street and they actually understood what you meant by the term sharing economy, they'd tell you it was about global platforms born from Silicon Valley, usually by men, being invested in with millions and billions of dollars. But I get very excited when the fact that cities are taking a much more different route. Peter was sharing this morning, and I'm sure he will again. But again, you can think about it as an organising principle for a smart and sustainable city. The example here is Korea, very much a top-down model, but we're seeing grassroots and top-down coming together in a range of cities across the world. The point is, you can think about the sharing economy as a global platform economy, or you can think about it as a local system. That's when things become incredibly interesting. And finally, let's talk about the fact that platforms do one thing. And I've used Uber there. It's an overused example generally, but it makes sense in the context of this example. Platforms do one thing. So Uber's got very, very good at doing what it does. And if you look at the successful sharing economy marketplaces that you see around, when we say successful, we mean in terms of global users in this instance, they all do one thing. And if you look at the failure rate of most of the sharing economy platforms, sort of between sort of 2011, 10, 2012-ish, most of them failed. There was a very dominant theme of trying to share everything and everything. So this is the hyper-local sharing marketplace for anything, whether you want a drill or a lawnmower, whatever. And most of those have failed. And there's been another wave of people that haven't learned the fact that that's quite a difficult thing to do. So platforms do one thing. Amazon used to do one thing too. And it got very, very, very good at selling books. And then when it got very good at selling books and it had crowded out and been very successful, most of the other booksellers on the internet, it started to do two things. It started to diversify what it did. So yes, it sells books, but it also sells ukuleles and, all sorts of different other things, socks. You can pretty much go to Amazon and find anything that you want. So it diversified, and then it started to extend itself through the value chain. So yes, it would sell you the book, but it would also sell you the device on which to read the book as well. So the question that's been in my mind, thinking about marketplaces that need healthy critical mass of supply and demand, they need liquidity, does the sharing economy at a global level have monopolistic tendencies? So will Uber start to diversify into a whole range of other areas? It's already started extending itself into the value chain when it comes to thinking about investing in autonomous vehicles. So this is an interesting to see how that will play out. Which comes to the fact, will we see new models of ownership? There's been something bubbling away, probably for the last 18 months really, which is about the rise of the digital cooperative. These are alternative forms of sharing economy platforms that have the features and value that's inherent within some of our most successful ones, but they have a different model of ownership, so it's cooperative. Many of you will know cooperatives have been around for a couple of centuries, I think. This is where people own the value. You're engaged in a platform that you partially own. The other quite exciting and radical possibility is that instead of going towards sort of full ownership, we go to completely non-ownership. This is where we think about a rejection of ownership entirely through the use of the blockchain and perhaps other technologies that might emerge, but one that is fully transparent, fully distributed, unowned. There is no business model in that argument because it's completely open source, everyone owns it, you've got a transparent ledger of trust. There's a way in which if some of those blockchain technologies really kind of get fully exploited in the sharing economy, what looks very radical today will look very, very old-fashioned in a few years' time. So finally, what to say? I haven't left you with any answers at all. All I'm going to leave you with is a few questions, which is, are we talking about a sharing economy that benefits the many or benefits the few? Does it exacerbate inequality or does it increase diversity? Are we going to see a growing interest in platforms for sharing that actually take money out of the equation entirely or introduce new forms of currency backed by data or energy or time? Will peer-to-peer continue to dominate the marketplace, or will it sort of collapse actually and become, in a way, a little bit more traditional, a little bit more business to consumer? Will we understand the sharing economy as a global system or a local system? And I sort of think I know which I prefer. What greater environmental and social value could come from being a bit more imaginative about how we perceive this in terms of policy and public sector reform? And finally, are these just yesterday's potatoes, to use an English phrase? Is this, will we disrupt the disruptors and genuinely create something that looks a whole lot different and perhaps we cannot possibly predict today? So thank you very much.